Okay guys, welcome to our next lesson in the unit of functions. We're talking about analyzing functions right now. Today we're talking about domain and range. So our objectives, what you should know by the end of today, what domain and range are, and how to identify the domain and the range of a function. Alright, so domain is the input of a function. It's what we get to put into a function. And the range is the output of a function. It's what we get out of a function. The example that you guys should be pretty familiar with at this point was when we were graphing absolute value functions. We were kind of discovering what that graph looks like. So we set up our xy tables, and we got to pick x values. Our x value was our input. Okay, we got to pick x values. We got to pick 0, 1, -1, -3, stuff like that. Alright, so now our output, what we get out of the function after we pick what we put in, is our y value. So when we put in 0 for x, y would be 0. When we put in 1 for x, y would be 1. When we put in -1 for x, y would be 1. And -3 for x, y would be 3. Okay, so that's the difference between input and output. The input values are the domain. The domain are your x values. The range are your y values, so your output values. Alright, so looking at these brackets just kind of denote a set of numbers. That's how we're going to write a set of numbers that are discrete, that are distinct points. So right here, for our domain, we said our domain was x values, so 1, 4, and 6. That's what we have here. And our range, we said was y values, our output values, so that's 3, 7, and -1, and that's what we have over here. Okay, same thing with the second one. Domain values are your x values, 2, 3, and 5. And range values are your y values, 4, 4, and 4. Okay, and 2, 3, and 5 is our domain. So now, notice for our range was 4, 4, and 4. We don't really have to write that out 3 different times. We're looking at all the possible y values in a relation. So the only possible y value is 4, so we only write it once. Okay? For our next one, domain stuff, 1, 3, and 1. And range stuff, -2, 2, and 6. And again, 1 repeats itself. We only have to write it once. It's only possible for the one time. Okay, domain and range, same concept. Domain, again, we write it in these brackets. That means we're listing some discrete numbers. So domain is our x values. And our possible x values here are 2, 3, and 4. And our possible range values, again, range was our y values, are -3, 7, and 8. Notice I didn't go in order for the range values. The acceptable math way to write range and domain stuff is from least to greatest. So start with the least value. The smallest value here is -3, and then 7, then 8. So we write it like that. Our domain for the second one, our domain is our x values, smallest to greatest, so that would be -5, -2, and 3. And then our range is our possible y values. So the only possible y value here is 4. So the only y value that is in this relationship. Okay, so now we're going to look at domain and range on a graph. And we're going to write our answers in interval notation, and also how they relate to inequality notation. So for our domain, again, we're looking at x values. Okay? Remember, domain is x values, range is y values. So you're looking at the x values that this graph hits. Okay? So this graph goes over to, it looks like a -2. Yeah, that's a -2. Okay? So it goes from -2 on the x-axis all the way over to 2. Okay? So first we'll do inequality notation. So if we go from -2, and we want to include -2 because that's a closed circle. Remember, we shade stuff in on the graph and we want to include in our answer. So we want to include -2, and it goes up to 2, and we don't want to include 2 because it's an open circle. So now this is inequality notation, and here's interval notation. From -2 to 2, square bracket for -2, because we want to include -2, and parenthesis for 2, because we don't want to include 2, because it's an open circle there. Alright, now for our range, remember range, we're looking at y values. So for the range, we're going from -2, that's the lowest y value on the graph, all the way up to 4, that's the highest y value on the graph. So we go from -2, and we include -2, it's a closed circle, and we go up to 4. Notice we use y now for our range, because ranges are y values. So now putting that in interval notation, we want to include -2, we're going up to 4, we don't want to include 4, so we use a parenthesis. Alright, so in the last graph, it kind of stopped at 2 points. What happens when it goes on forever? For our domain, if you think about the x values that it's going to hit, if this goes on forever, it's never going to stop hitting x values. There's never a time over here where we can just draw a line up and it stops. It goes on forever. So, it goes from -infinity to infinity. Writing that in interval notation, we use parentheses for infinities every time. That's how that would look. So for our range, however, it does stop, okay? It stops at -1. That's the lowest value, that's the lowest y value it hits. And it does hit -1, so we want to include -1. And it goes upwards forever. So it goes up to infinity. So now in interval notation, we want to include -1. We're going up to infinity. Remember, infinity stuff, never-ending stuff, always uses a parenthesis. So now you should be able to identify domain and range from a relation and from a graph. Write down any questions you have. Bring them to class tomorrow. Have a good night, guys.